I'm out here on the balcony of my apartment complex, and I'm going to show you a demonstration of plein air painting. So, plein air painting is a term that really just means painting outside. And plein air painting was really instrumental for the Impressionist movement. So artists like Cezanne and Degas and John Singer Sargent were, for the most part, doing a lot of painting outdoors. Sometimes they would come back to the same place at the same time of day for several days in a row over the course of a long period of time in order to capture a specific kind of daylight. Sometimes the Impressionists would sit in one place and try to capture the way that light was changing before their eyes. So you can do this project from a balcony, or I really recommend going to a park, sitting on a bench in your neighborhood, or maybe you even want to look out a window. If there's like a gloomy day, you might have something picturesque from outside of your window. That being said, if you want to really be a hardcore plein air painter, maybe you want to go on a hike and bring all of your painting gear set up on the side of a trail. That being said, there is plenty of beauty to be found just around where you live, just in the more mundane things. So this section of apartments is something I've been looking at for a while. Every day I come out here on the same time, and I've noticed that the shadows hit these buildings around a very specific kind of time of day in a really interesting way that I'd like to try to capture. So I recommend, if there's something like that close by to you, like maybe it's a specific tree that has a really funny bend in it that you've seen when you go on a walk frequently. Maybe you want to think of that as your muse for the project. So keep in mind that inspiration is all around us. So for this project, I want you to make two plein air paintings. The first one, I want you to make using a limited color palette by choosing two complementary colors and using those two tones to make a series of neutrals. So I've chosen some tertiary colors, such as a purple blue and an orange yellow, as my complements. So even though these are colors that I specifically mixed up from multiple tubes of paint, they are directly across from each other on the color wheel, which will make them really beautiful complements that have a visual intensity when put next to each other and in the saturated form, but they'll also create some really harmonious chromatic black tones and grays, kind of like what you might have mixed for the last project or for your color maps. So before you begin, I recommend looking at your space that you're painting, and after you've decided on your two complementary colors, we're really going to think about what values and what temperature of color are we seeing in the world in front of us. So I recommend begin by just making a color map. This is something that you probably did for this last sketchbook assignment. Hopefully you did it. And make a quick color map on a piece of watercolor paper. And I'm just going to go ahead and map out a bunch of the tones that I already have. I've already gone ahead and did a bunch of paint mixing before y'all caught me here. And I'm just putting some tones down just to compare what kinds of colors I have and what kinds of colors I need. So I have a rich chromatic black tone right here. It's a kind of a rich purple black. Oops. I also have more of a greenish bluish black. That's a really lovely black tone. And I'm really just looking and mixing up tones as I go. And I've mixed quite a bit of my slow drying medium in with my paint, which allowed me to go ahead and mix up a wide variety of tones just with my two complements, which are my purple blue tone, my purple violet, and my orange yellow. So I have my two complements and some white, and I mixed up the rest of these tones just by mixing up different ratios of these colors. So I recommend making a quick color map before you begin. Don't forget to mix in plenty of slow dry medium so you have a palette that'll last you a little while. And then we'll get into the next step. All right. All right. So once you've made your color map and mixed up some tones with your two complementary colors, mixed up a wide variety of values, you can start on your painting. So it's up to you how many painting sessions you'd like to make each painting in. You could just limit yourself to one really solid painting session, or maybe you want to work on it for 2 days each. But I'm going to go ahead and begin my painting with an underpainting, which is something you've probably practiced already. But I'm going to start with a tone that I want to really show up in my painting later, but in a really subtle way. So I think I'm going to use some of my orange yellow tone for my base coat, my base layer. All right, so I'm going to do my underpainting using a reductive method this time. So I'm first going to really loosely map out my composition, but it'll be really helpful to use a viewfinder. I'm going to use my viewfinder, close one eye to decide on a composition. Keep in mind that my perspective is going to be a little different than yours. So when you're deciding on your composition, deciding maybe how many trees, how many of whatever you're looking at are going to show up in your frame, and deciding on where the edges of the picture plane going to line up, because the world is really expansive. We can't quite capture it all. Okay, so then I'm going to use a wet rag and a finger, and I'm just going to wipe away some highlights that I see. So here I'm really looking for the biggest moments of light and shadow that I see. So I'm squinting my eyes and I'm thinking about what are the most general shapes and how do they relate to each other when it comes to value. And next I'll use my brush, and I'm really going to be thinking about contour line for this part of my underpainting. And this is a really important part of the drawing process. So I'm really establishing some proportions here. How big is one triangle? There's a lot of triangles in the thing that I'm painting. How big is one shape compared to a shape close by? When you're creating your underpainting, you really want to quickly jot down the relationships that you're seeing, whether it's the relationship in scale or distance between one thing or another, or if it's the difference between one angle and a different angle that you're looking at. You might be working with something that's much more organic than me, which is great, but there's still going to be, angularity in some way or another, whether it's like the angle of your horizon or the angles of the things that you're seeing in the landscape before you. This is also a good opportunity to use some sighting skills. So hold something like a pencil or a brush, hold it out in front of you to measure an angle. What is one angle like compared to another? Sometimes thinking about the horizontal and vertical sort of axis of your picture plane can be really helpful. That way you can compare the angles that you're measuring to a perfectly horizontal or vertical angle. So I've drawn this angle a little bit too sharply down or a little bit too straight. So I'm going to go ahead and correct that. Remember that if you have some lines in your underpainting that are a little unfinished
or some lines that are incorrect, that's totally okay. You're going to be painting over this entire stage of the process. But this is really a fantastic stage for you to figure things out and solve some of those bigger problems before you go in and start layering in color. So mistakes are going to happen, but I recommend just grab a little bit darker of a tone and correct that line. Really go through and double check what you're looking at. Take a big step back from it and ask yourself how your general underpainting or drawing is coming across.
Alright, so once you've mapped in your composition with some major contour lines, then I recommend working from back to front. So I'm going to be painting the sky, the thing that's furthest back in the horizon. Go ahead and mix up the colors and pop them in.
I also just wanted to take some time to go over some really important concepts. So while you may not be able to achieve the exact color that you're seeing with a more limited palette, instead you'll get some practice in interpreting your subject with a harmonious complementary color scheme. So when you're using two complementary colors, mixing them together and mixing a wide, vast range of different tones just from those two tones and white, you'll be able to practice honing in on value, but also honing in on the temperature of the colors that you're seeing. So how dark or light or warm or cool are the tones that you're seeing out there in the world? You can also use this as an opportunity to practice mixing chromatic complementary neutral colors and balancing neutral tones with saturated tones. So your two complementary colors, when used in their saturated forms, can create a really lovely emphasis and a really beautiful sense of intensity when they're used in their most saturated forms. But you can also mix them together in different ratios, as well as create tints of them by adding a bit of white, in order to create a vast array of different kinds of neutral tones. Using just these two complementary tones plus white will create a color family that all functions with a really beautiful harmony because they're all stemming from the two major pigments. When you're composing, which is probably going to be during your underpainting stage, I recommend using the rule of thirds or situating your major focal points 1/3 of the way across your composition, which can be a way of creating compositional balance, but also leading your viewer's eye through the space with a sense of movement and balance. I also recommend using both transparent and opaque colors. So sometimes using a bit more of your medium with your tones, but sometimes laying it on pretty thick in order to create a wider variety of tones. Remember that when you add a little bit of white to any tone, it'll generally make it a bit more opaque. Also, when you're mixing two complementary colors together to create a chromatic black or a dark neutralized tone, keep in mind the wide variety of chromatic possibilities when you change the ratio of your two major complements in white to your neutralized mixture. So add a little bit of this or a little bit of that and just see what happens. You're really going to have fun when you start to really dive into the shadows that you see and really interpreting what colors do you see in the shadows. It's very rare that the colors that we see out in the world are just a boring gray. Instead, really look for what kind of temperature are those darker tones in those shadows. Chromatic shadows are really, really important to making a vivid painting. Also remember that whatever hue and value is underneath any given layer, that will affect the tone that you put on top. Also, when two tones are placed right next to each other, they will optically mix in order to create a third tone. This is why layering color can create such incredible variety and complexity. There's many different ways to create a sense of shading or gradient in your painting. But layering subtle shifts of a variety of different hues and tones can be one of the most successful ways.
So after you're done painting in your underpainting and mapping out your major contour lines of your composition with using your viewfinder and really checking your angles using some sighting skills, I recommend starting with the thing that's furthest back. It's probably the sky. So whenever you're painting a sky, sometimes there's a tendency to just reach for blue automatically. But in reality, the blues that I'm seeing, they're really rich and neutral. They're also very atmospheric. And to create atmospheric perspective, mixing in some of the complementary color is going to be really important. So that way you can create some tones that are more true to the atmospheric quality that you're seeing. So I've gone ahead and popped in some very general tones. And keep in mind, whenever you're painting from life, specifically when you're painting plein air or you're painting a landscape that's in front of you, you know, the world is way more complex than you can exactly copy in a moment. So there's always going to be a great deal of interpretation that's brought into the painting process. So keep in mind that while we're looking for inspiration in the world in front of us and we're translating and interpreting it over onto our page, that there's always going to be a little bit of our personal style that comes into it. That being said, I want you to really be working observationally, and instead of painting the idea of what you think a cloud looks like, I want you to really try to capture the nuanced details of what you're really seeing in the world. So I don't want to see any cartoon clouds, okay?
When we're painting from life, what we're really doing is we're painting the light. And light is something that is constantly changing throughout the day. So whatever you're painting, there's a good chance that it's been moving around. It's been shifting in color and value and tone and temperature. So these clouds I'm painting have been moving through the sky really rapidly as I paint this. While this might be the most challenging part of plein air painting, I also find it to be the most exhilarating part of the experience, because you're painting something that is changing, something that is alive. This quality of mutability, or something that's constantly changing, can lead to a lot of really exciting discoveries and opportunities for creative problem solving, but also interpreting and really kind of putting your own creative vision into the work. So I recommend working from general to specific and from back to front. So I'm starting by laying in some just really, really big basic shapes. And then I'm mixing up the specific values and tones that I want, and I'm gonna just pop them right in, starting with the ones that are furthest back. As I go, notice how I'm shifting my drawing. I'm shifting some of the angles, because I'm noticing that I made some mistakes in my underpainting. That is bound to happen. But it's also an opportunity to reinterpret it in a new way. So as you move closer to the viewer, I recommend letting each layer dry in between and really thinking about how one tone is going to sit on top of the other with contrast. I'm also allowing the directionality of my brushstrokes to almost move along with the direction of the surface that I'm painting in order to help capture the specific plane and how it's sitting in space, particularly in contrast and in reference to the planes and surfaces around them. Typically, in order to create atmospheric perspective, allowing your values to get more neutral, lighter, and kind of closer to each other in tone and value as they go further back in space can be really helpful. That's why I'm putting the most deep, high contrast tones in the foreground. While my values in the foreground are more high contrasted with more rich darks and lights close by, I also have my more saturated tones in the foreground and my more neutralized tones receding in space into the background. Allowing your edges to become more crisp and sharp in the foreground and fuzzier in the background will also help with creating depth.
Alright, y'all, so this is just the beginning of my painting. I will continue to build up detail, and I'll probably come back another time, sort of the same time of day. But I also just wanted to mention that at the beginning of this painting process for this painting, I had a moment where I really felt like things weren't working out. I should choose a different subject. This is too hard. I'm a fraud. I'm not even a real artist. But then I kept painting, and now I'm like, heck, it's happening. It's happening. So push through those moments where you're like, wait a minute, this subject is too difficult for me. Instead, approach the challenge and the subject with a sense of like, hey, it's an experiment. We'll just see what happens and try my best. So yeah, good luck with your complementary color plein air paintings. No matter what you choose to paint, whether it's like all super organic, or if you're honing in on just one subject, like one tree or plant, don't forget to really just sort of like have fun with the process. Really get in the flow in the moment of looking, and use it as a moment of really being observational with your surroundings. It really is I think a really fantastic way of connecting us to our environments. So good luck.